In the summer of 1983, chunks of red sandstone came flying out of the bottom of this dam. Not concrete, rock. The river had found a way inside the mountain, and the man who signed away this canyon had already spent 20 years calling it the greatest mistake of his life. Videos online will tell you Glen Canyon Dam is about to burst and take the American Southwest with it. Those videos are wrong, but the truth is stranger, because this dam was built on a promise that was already broken before the first shovel hit the ground, a number written on paper in 1922. Water that never existed. Hold on to that number. It explains everything that has happened since. The Colorado is not the biggest river in America. It is not even close. It is a river of moderate size, doing an impossible job. It drains parts of 7 states and 2 countries. It waters farms that feed the nation. It fills the taps of roughly 40 million people. And in an average year, it carries less water than a single decent-sized river in the East. That mismatch is the whole story. Everything else is detail. Before the dam, the river ran through a place called Glen Canyon, not the Grand Canyon. This was gentler country. Sandstone walls the color of rust and honey, curving and layered like folded cloth. Hundreds of side canyons, some of them so narrow a person could touch both walls at once. Springs, cottonwoods, hanging gardens of ferns growing straight out of the rock where water seeped through, ancestral Puebloan granaries tucked in the cliffs, and rock art thousands of years old. John Wesley Powell rode through it in 1869 and gave it its name, Glen Canyon, for the green glens hidden inside it. His men found one chamber with walls so smooth that a voice inside it hung in the air. They called it Music Temple and carved their names into the stone. Almost nobody else came. It was hard to reach, and there was no reason to go. For a century, Glen Canyon was the most beautiful landscape in America that almost no American had seen. That is why it was chosen. Now go back to that number. In November 1922, delegates from 7 states met in New Mexico to divide the Colorado River between them. They needed to know how much water there was. They used the records they had, which came mostly from the previous 2 decades. Those records said the river carried somewhere around 16.5 million acre-feet a year, so that is what they split. 7.5 million to the upper states, 7.5 to the lower states, and later a share promised to Mexico on top of that. The problem is that the men in that room had measured the river during one of the wettest stretches in a very long time. They did not know that. There was no way for them to know it. Tree rings would eventually tell the story, decades later, and the story was brutal. The 20th century, the century that built the American West, sat inside one of the wettest periods in something like 1,200 years. The river's true long-term average is meaningfully lower than what they divided up. So every state walked out of that room owning water that was never there. Not stolen, not mismanaged, just imaginary. The entire plumbing system of the American Southwest, every canal, every city, every dam, was built on top of a clerical fantasy. That is the curse. There is no ghost in this story. There is arithmetic, and arithmetic is patient. By the 1950s, the upper states wanted their share stored where they could control it. The Bureau of Reclamation proposed a dam at Echo Park, inside Dinosaur National Monument. Conservationists fought it, and fought it hard, led by a mountaineer named David Brower of the Sierra Club. They won. Echo Park was saved, and in the bargaining, they let a different site go without a real fight, because almost none of them had ever been there. Glen Canyon. Brower would later float the canyon he had traded away. He saw what was in it. He spent the rest of his life saying he had made the worst mistake of his career, and he said it publicly, repeatedly, to anyone who would listen. A book of photographs came out under the title, The Place No One Knew. That was the point. Nobody knew, so nobody defended it. A canyon can be lost simply by being unfamiliar. On October 15, 1956, President Eisenhower pressed a telegraph key in Washington and set off the first blast in the canyon walls. What followed was one of the hardest construction jobs of the era. There was no town, no road, no bridge, no power. Everything had to be invented on site. They built a town first, on the bare mesa above, on land obtained in a trade with the Navajo Nation. They named it Page. Trailers, dust, and heat that regularly pushed past 100 degrees in a place with no shade for 50 miles. Then they built a bridge, because the 2 rims were 700 feet above the water, and a truck could not get from one side to the other without a 200-mile detour. When it was finished, it was the highest arch bridge in the world. Then they had to move the river. Two diversion tunnels were driven straight through solid sandstone, each one wide enough to swallow a house, and in 1959 the Colorado was pushed into them, leaving the riverbed dry. Men went down into that empty channel and dug out the loose rock until they reached bedrock that could carry a mountain of concrete. The canyon walls themselves were the danger. Navajo sandstone is beautiful, and it is not entirely trustworthy. It is porous. It has seams. Men called high scalers were lowered on ropes down the vertical faces, hundreds of feet above the ground, swinging on cable with jackhammers and drills, stripping the loose rock off the cliff so the dam could be keyed into something solid. Then crews pumped grout deep into the sandstone under enormous pressure, filling the seams, trying to seal a sponge. The concrete arrived by cableway, buckets, riding steel lines strung across the gorge, the same trick used at Kariba and Hoover. Nearly 5 million cubic yards of it went into the wall. Fresh concrete generates heat as it cures, enough heat that a block this size would crack itself apart while setting, so they threaded pipes through it and ran chilled water through the pipes for years to cool the structure from the inside. The finished wall stands 710 feet tall. It is an arch dam curved upstream, so the weight of the reservoir does not push it over. It presses the arch into the canyon walls and locks it tighter. The harder the water pushes, the stronger the geometry gets. That is the elegance of it. And it is also why the rock on either side matters more than the concrete in the middle. 18 men died building it. In March 1963, the gates closed and the canyon began to fill. It took 17 years to reach full pool. Lake Powell, when it is full, stretches 186 miles upstream and has more shoreline than the entire west coast of the continental United States. It is one of the largest reservoirs ever built, and it drowned everything Powell had named. Music Temple went under, with the carved names of his crew still on the wall. Hole in the Rock, where Mormon pioneers had lowered wagons down a cliff by rope, went under. Cathedral in the desert, a chamber with a waterfall and a shaft of light coming down through the sandstone, went under. Hundreds of archaeological sites went under, some surveyed in a frantic salvage effort, many not. Thousands of years of human presence in those side canyons, recorded in a hurry and then submerged. The water also backed up to Rainbow Bridge, a natural stone arch that is sacred to Navajo, Hopi, Ute, and San Juan Southern Paiute people. Traditional practitioners objected. They argued that the reservoir desecrated a place used in prayer and would not permit them to practice. The case went to federal court, and they lost. The water stayed. There was no curse spoken over this dam by a river god, but there were people who told the government, on the record and in advance, that something irreplaceable was being destroyed, and the government proceeded anyway. That is a different kind of warning, and it has aged just as badly. Downstream, the Grand Canyon began to change in ways nobody had planned for. The Colorado had always been warm, wild, and thick with red silt. That is where the name comes from. The dam takes water from deep in the reservoir, so the river below it now runs cold and clear all year. The floods that used to rebuild the beaches were switched off. The sandbars started to shrink. Native fish that had evolved in muddy, seasonal water declined sharply, and the humpback chub became a symbol of the whole problem. Managers now release deliberate artificial floods to try to rebuild the sand. It helps. It does not fix it. In March 1981, a group of activists unrolled 300 feet of black plastic down the face of the dam so that from a distance, it looked like an enormous crack had opened in the concrete. It was theater. It was also the first time most Americans had ever looked at this dam and considered that it might not last forever. 2 years later, it almost didn't. Here is the part everyone gets wrong. Remember that the reservoir took 17 years to fill. It finally touched full pool in the summer of 1980. So for the first time in the dam's life, there was no empty space left upstream. And then the winter of 1982 into 1983 dumped an enormous snowpack across the Rockies, and a warm, wet spring melted it all at once. Water started arriving faster than the 8 turbines could pass it. The turbines are not a flood control device, they are a straw. So the operators had to use the spillways for the first time in the dam's history. Those are the 2 old diversion tunnels, reworked, one in each canyon wall, each capable of carrying a river. They opened the gates, and then the dam began to shake. Not a vibration, a deep, physical rumbling that people could feel through the concrete and hear from the visitor center. and out of the mouth of the left spillway tunnel, the discharge changed color and started spitting out chunks of red sandstone and broken concrete. The mechanism is called cavitation, and it is the quiet villain of this entire story. When water moves fast enough past an imperfection in a surface, the pressure drops so low that the water flashes into vapor. Tiny bubbles form. Then they hit a zone of higher pressure and collapse. Instantly, violently, millions of times per second. Each collapse is a microscopic hammer blow. Together, they chew through hardened concrete like it is chalk, and once they reach the rock behind it, they excavate. Inside that tunnel, the water was moving at highway speeds. It had stripped the lining and torn a cavern out of the sandstone, tens of feet deep and well over 100 feet long, in a matter of days. The tunnel was eating itself while carrying the flood it was built to carry. Now the operators were in a trap. Closing the spillway meant the reservoir would keep rising and eventually pour over the top of the dam, which is the one thing an arch dam must never do. Leaving it open meant the tunnel would keep digging toward the abutment. So they did something that sounds absurd for a structure of this size. They went to the hardware store. Crews bolted sheets of plywood along the top of the spillway gates to buy a few feet of extra reservoir storage while they built proper steel flashboards to replace them. 4x8 sheets of plywood holding back one of the largest reservoirs in North America while the dam rumbled underneath them. It worked. The runoff peaked, the reservoir crested a few feet above full pool, and the water started falling. Nobody died. The dam held. Afterward, engineers went into the tunnels and found the damage. The fix was clever and almost embarrassingly simple. They cut aeration slots into the tunnel walls, notches that inject air into the flow. Air bubbles cushion the collapsing vapor bubbles and blunt the hammer. The tunnels were repaired, the slots installed, and Glen Canyon's spillway problem was solved. Hold on to that solution too. It comes back, because after 1983, the story flips completely. In the year 2000, the Colorado River Basin entered a drought that has not meaningfully ended. It is dry enough and long enough that scientists stopped calling it a drought and started calling it a megadrought, and studies of tree rings put it among the driest stretches in more than 1,000 years. Part of it is natural cycle. A significant part of it is warming, which pulls moisture out of the soil and the snowpack before it ever reaches the river. Lake Powell began to drop, and as it dropped, it exposed a white mineral crust on the canyon walls, hundreds of feet of it, marking where the water used to be, a bathtub ring around the second largest reservoir in the country. Then something nobody expected. The canyons started coming back. As the water fell, side canyons reappeared, choked with sediment and stinking of decay at first, then slowly clearing. Cathedral in the desert emerged again, briefly, its waterfall running for the first time in 40 years. Up at the far end, near height, the Colorado came back as an actual river and began cutting a new channel down through the mud it had spent decades depositing. Rapids that had drowned in the 1960s started making noise again. It was beautiful, and it was a warning. Because that sediment is the other hole in this story, the one almost nobody talks about. Every reservoir on a silty river is slowly filling with dirt. The Colorado has always carried an enormous sediment load, and all of it stops at the dam. That is a clock that only runs one direction, and there is no realistic way to reverse it. By 2021, the situation was serious. By 2022, it was an emergency. Federal managers began holding back water that was legally owed downstream and releasing emergency water from a reservoir hundreds of miles upstream just to prop up the level at Powell. In April 2023, the lake hit its lowest point since it was first filled, somewhere around 22% of capacity. At that point, two thresholds became the only numbers that mattered. The first is minimum power pool. Below that elevation, the intakes for the 8 turbines start pulling air along with water, and the power plant that supplies electricity across a huge swath of the West has to shut down. Powell got within roughly 30 feet of it. 30 feet, on a reservoir that had already dropped more than 150. The second is dead pool. Below that elevation, the turbine intakes are above the waterline entirely, and the only way water can get past this dam is through 4 steel bypass tubes set lower in the structure. Those tubes exist, they work. But their combined capacity is a fraction of what the power plant can pass, and they were designed for occasional use, not for carrying an entire river year after year. And in 2023, After those tubes had been run hard during a high-flow release, inspectors went in and found damage, cavitation damage. The same mechanism that ate the spillway in 1983 in a different part of the same dam, in equipment that the entire lower basin would depend on if the lake ever fell that far. Federal engineers have been studying modifications ever since, precisely because relying on those tubes long-term is not something anyone wants to gamble on. There was a reprieve. The winter of 2022 into 2023 delivered a massive snowpack, and Powell rose sharply. It bought years. It did not buy a solution, and the years since have swung back toward dry. Meanwhile, the reservoir has warmed at the surface as it shrank, and warm water near the intakes let smallmouth bass, a predator that eats native fish, pass through the dam into the Grand Canyon for the first time. A drought problem became a plumbing problem, became an extinction problem, all through the same wall. And running underneath every bit of it is that 1922 number. The rules that govern how this river is shared have been patched and renegotiated for a century, and the current set of operating guidelines expires in 2026. 7 states are still arguing over how to divide a river that has never once, on average, contained what they promised each other it did. So was Glen Canyon Dam cursed from the start? Not by a river god, by a spreadsheet. The dam is not cracking. Engineers monitor it constantly, the arch is sound, and no serious analysis says it is about to fail and drown the Southwest. That is not the danger. The danger is far slower and far harder to televise, which is exactly why it gets ignored. Look at what this river has actually done. It flooded the structure with a snowpack the operators did not expect and tore a cavern out of the mountain in a matter of days. It has spent a quarter century simply refusing to show up. It has hollowed out the reservoir until the canyon it drowned started rising back out of the water like something remembering itself. And when the operators reached for the emergency plumbing, the river started eating that too. Glen Canyon was traded away by people who had never seen it, to store water that was never counted correctly, behind a wall that has been fighting for its own relevance ever since. David Brower spent 40 years asking for it back, and died without getting it. The Navajo, Hopi, Ute, and Paiute people who objected to what happened at Rainbow Bridge did not get their case heard the way they wanted either. Nothing here broke. That is the point. The wall still stands, and it will very likely stand for a long time. It is just that every single year, this dam has to be argued for, negotiated over, replumbed, and defended. The hole in the spillway, the tubes, the sediment, the snowpack that may or may not arrive, none of it is finished. Glen Canyon Dam is not a dam that failed. It is a dam that can never stop being saved.